going on very successfully. And so on behalf of TDU and with Czech Republic, I invite Dr. Rajindra Puri. I no need to introduce because already we have in the webinar poster, you can see we have given him very clearly about his work that he has done on the ecology, anthropology. He has a unique combination. Generally, people don't have this sort of unique combination. Either they become a pure ethnobotanist or a pure real ethnopharmacologist. This is something which is very unique on the ecological anthropologist. This is something which, as ethnobotanist, he's been trained to, and he has worked all over the country and the world. In India, he has worked, and all over the world also, like Indonesia. He has worked on the rainforest valley and several things which he has done. I think now once we start his presentation, you will be knowing much about his work and his ideas that he has on. So I will not take much of the time because we need time to really go on to the presentation as such. So I think, yes, we welcome Rajindra Puri for agreeing for us and making the students to give an insight on your case study. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much. And pleasure to be here speaking to the Global Ethnobotany webinar series. What I'm going to do is, can I just request everyone mute themselves so we don't have some feedback? And what I'll do is I will say something about myself and my past research and the kind of institutions I'm associated with. And then I'll talk a little bit about this case study on what I'm now calling, well, for this seminar, I've called the Ethnobotany of Change. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And I apologize, it's a little bit sort of half-baked, as we would say, but I've been toying around with this idea for a while, and I just thought I would contextualize the kind of research I've been doing in southern India in terms of this idea of an ethnobotany of change. And I'll say more about what I might mean by that, but really it's more of a provocation for all of you out there, students, to think about change and sort of a temporal dimension, if you want to put it that way, of ethnobotany. And I'm not saying this is anything new. There's been plenty of research done about change, and I'll go through some of those classic studies, but it might be an interesting kind of framework to start thinking about today's context. And then my case study is about Lantana camara invasion in southern India, in the Hills of southern Karnataka, northern Tamil Nadu, where I've been working with colleagues at Atri for almost 10 years now, on and off. I haven't had a chance to do that much field work, but have relied heavily on their excellent research over decades in that area. And so I'm very humbly adding just a little bit of knowledge about that area. So as was mentioned, I do have a strong background in both biology and anthropology as an undergraduate and a master's student. And I kind of discovered ethnobotany as an undergraduate when I spent a year in Australia. And you please mute yourselves. I can't. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, mute yourself. Yeah.
So I discovered ethnobotany and ethnobiology more generally as an undergraduate studying for a year in Australia, and did some research in New Guinea on birds and trapping, and that got me interested in ethnobiology more generally, ethnobotany. So my research, though, as a PhD student, focused mostly on hunting, and this monograph, Deadly Dances in the Bornean Rainforest, as a result of that dissertation research. But of course, hunting and hunters in Borneo rely heavily on their knowledge of plants for hunting. So much of the hunting material is made from plants, whether it's a blowpipe or the poisons used in fishing, or blowpipe darts. And of course, you have to understand that the nature of the ecology of tropical forests and fruiting and flowering cycles to understand hunting patterns based on animal migrations, etc. So in the end, you can start out studying one thing, you end up studying everything, don't you? So from there, I went on to look at non-timber forest products, trade in some of the forest fruits in Borneo as they became commodified. I was looking sort of at the impacts of what happens when you commodify a fruit like Democarpus longan, known locally as mata kucing, and how that affected the local livelihoods and people's relationship to those trees. And the area I worked in central, in eastern Kalimantan in Borneo then became a national park. And so I worked with park researchers providing baseline data and training local people to participate in conservation research and management. And that led to various kinds of projects with the Center for International Forestry Research and other organizations on integrating local people's knowledge into survey methods, into co-management, et cetera. And then from that, I ended up at Kent teaching, and with my colleagues like Helen Newing from DICE, we began to run workshops and put together this book on conservation practice, particularly looking at social science methods and how they can be used to integrate people into conservation. Other projects I've been involved with here, looking at the transmission of traditional knowledge, cultural transmission, here a study of basketry and basket making, which in Kalimantan in Indonesia is made from rattan and rattan canes. So in this kind of a project, we looked at the way children and young people learn how to make baskets and try to understand the full range of knowledge, from being able to find, locate rattans, harvest them, process them, dye them, and turn them into various kinds of products, and how that knowledge is changing over time as alternatives to baskets become available, such as plastic bags. But that was an interesting project published in this book, Understanding Cultural Transmission in Anthropology. Also applying ethnobotanical research and methods to co-management. This project in Sabah in Malaysia, the Crocker Range, with colleagues in the School of Anthropology and Conservation at Kent, working with the Sabah parks and NGOs and communities together to try and find a way to integrate local people's knowledge and practices into the management of a protected area through the establishment of traditional use zones. And that was funded over a series of Darwin initiatives to establish, again, the kind of the rights, but also the basis for integrating people into conservation, and relied heavily on training local people to do their own research and to document their own uses of plants in the forests. I've always been interested in the weather, and so I've been interested really since the 2000s in local knowledge about weather predicting and forecasting, and often that involves the use of plants and flowers and looking at phenology. So local people will often be able to predict the weather based on the arrival of certain insects and animals and birds, as well as I said, the changing cycles of flowering and fruiting of certain species. More recently, I have been looking at, in projects in India and Spain and in the UK itself, about complexity and the complex systems that people are embedded in, including their knowledge of plants, and how people are responding to change and this complexity. You know, the world we live in is quite dynamic at the moment, and we have cases of rural areas emptying out, what they call rural flight, urbanization. We've got changes in market economies, globalization, of course, massive environmental changes caused by climate, but also habitat destruction, invasive species, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a complex set of drivers, if you want to call them that, social, cultural, economic, ecological, climatic, that are affecting all parts of the world somewhat differently. And what I'm interested in is how local people or communities are responding to this complex of change. And I think that will become very clear when I talk about the case from Karnataka. But what I want to say is that southern India, southern Spain, and southern UK are very similar in terms of this kind of impact of all of these changes. The way people respond, of course, is very local and contextual, but I think rural peoples everywhere are going through very similar kinds of changes or contexts these days. And the project that I'm going to talk about today was part of a larger project on human adaptation to biodiversity change. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But again, it is about understanding local people's responses to the way climate change and other kinds of forces are changing the plants and animals around them. And this is especially the case for people who are really dependent on agriculture, gathering, hunting, fishing, etc. Now, I am also the director of the Center for Biocultural Diversity at the University of Kent. And we have a website, so you can find out about some of the research projects we're involved in. And these are looking at this relationship between biological and cultural diversity, and in this kind of modern context. And this gives you an idea of some of the great variety of ongoing projects there, and also applications to interventions for advocacy, et cetera, working in a variety of different contexts around the world, our students, PhD students, and staff members. And so this covers some of the things. I should say in the top left corner, our Kent Ethnobotanical Herbarium is about to go live at the end of the month. We've digitized a voucher collection that we have. But otherwise, you can find out more about these projects online. I also am the convener of the Ethnobotany Master's Program at Kent, which is now celebrating its 25th class. And we've had roughly 10 students a year on average, but more recently from all over the world, doing field work in more than 45 countries, and going on to do PhDs, working in botanical gardens, working for healthcare institutions or government departments, ministries at the international, national levels, also for conservation NGOs, plant NGOs. Many have started their own businesses or gone to work for business, and are involved in education, either higher education or other kinds of more informal education about the importance of plants. And this is a picture of this year's class who have just gotten started here. And again, you can find more about our program on the University of Kent website. Every year we hold an annual lecture called the Annual Kent Q Distinguished Ethnobotanist Lecture. This was the 23rd one we held earlier this month. You can find it now online at the CBCD, that is the Center for Biocultural Diversity YouTube site, where you'll find the last few years of lectures available, recorded lectures. And this year we had Dr. Mark Nesbitt, who is our convener of the Ethnobotany program at the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. And he is also the curator of the Economic Botany Collection, which is what he talked about, and how ethnobotanical research can make use of collections in museums and herbaria around the world. We publish a book series, the Environmental Anthropology and Ethnobiology book series with Berghahn Books, and you can find, if you go online to them, the latest monographs that cover environmental anthropology, ethnobiology, ethnobotany. This is just a copy of our YouTube site, and there's some videos there from students and projects, the webinar series that we run on psychoactive plants, and the lectures from Kew. All right, so let's get to the sort of the meat of the issue this morning. So I've been thinking about an ethnobotany of change as a kind of title to capture some of the more dynamic aspects of ethnobotanical knowledge and ethnobotanical practices, and the kind of dynamics and changes that they go through. So that's looking at the temporal dimension. I think we've done a very good job historically of documenting local people's knowledge of plants and their uses around the world. These are fairly static kinds of studies. And it's not easy to study the way these systems change. But basically what I would say is that let's think of an ethnobotany of change involving studies that look at the changing relationships of people and plants. So I like to think of ethnobotany as a study of the relationship of people and plants, neither people nor plants, but their relationships. And this is looking at how those relationships are changing. Now, this can be at different scales. We can talk about changes in the relationship between people and domesticated crops. And for instance, the way they are creating new varieties over time, that would be, or kind of breeding and modifying important plant species over time. Or we can look at whole habitats, landscape level scales, and how those are shifting and changing over time as people adopt new livelihood strategies or as the environment in fact changes. And of course, we know that our relationships between plants and people are both material in a utilitarian sense. People use plants for various material culture and activities, but also symbolic in the sense that plants play a role in our culture and in religions, belief systems, and are used to represent various ideas in myths, stories, etc., contemporary art, theater, etc. And of course, we also have a relationship to plants that we represent cognitively in what we think of as folk biological classification. Right? And here we're talking about both changing knowledge as well as changing practices, right? So ethnobotanical knowledge is not just theoretical and what people know, but it's also what they do, how they do it, the skills involved, for instance, in weaving a basket or cooking or processing, etc. So we know that ethnobotanical practices, ethnobotanical knowledge, these things are highly integrated, and they are all subject to change. One of the biggest changes that everyone's documenting is the maintenance of theoretical knowledge, that people know the uses of plants, but they don't know how to use them. This loss of practice, loss of ability to for instance, process poisonous plants, because we know the plants are poisonous, but the knowledge and opportunities to use them have decreased or disappeared. And when we're talking about change, yes, we're also talking not just about knowledge loss, but also knowledge gain. You know, how are various peoples gaining new knowledge about plants and new knowledge about their changing environments? And that's to some extent what we'll be talking about with my case. And knowledge being transformed and innovated so to adapt to changing conditions. Certainly with the basketry project, we saw how local people were creating new kinds of products to satisfy new markets and new kinds of activities to keep up with the market, and also to innovate in their practice. And when we're talking about change, of course, change can be internal, that is internal to a knowledge system or a group of people, and it can come from outside. And in this case, you know, if we think about the environment as changing and people adapting to it, yeah, sort of external changes, but internally to a group of people or a culture or a knowledge system, like a folk classification system, there are inherent changes that occur. Knowledge is not static, and it will occur, it will change and transform over time. So what are some of these kinds of changes we can look at? Well, obviously, the domestication of plants historically is a major change. And many ethnobotanists have spent their careers studying domestication, how it occurred, why it occurred, where it occurred. And that's a continuing study. So there's archaeologists, archaeobotanists, lots of people involved in the domestication of plants. And we can even see today the traditional knowledge associated with breeding, with grafting, etc., which is still relevant. Of course, humans have over a long period of time had a long relationship with plants, our primate past, and through the effects of ice ages and other climatic variation and landscape changes, people have had to adapt to those kinds of changes. And it's possible through the archaeological record, we can begin to look at those shifts. Most important of which probably is this shift over the last ice age, where people overhunted large mammals, and then their diets had to sort of broaden, and perhaps led to the domestication or the beginnings of the cultivation of plants and their domestication. On a more historical level, some of the kinds of changes that have affected ethnobiological knowledge systems might be the introduction of codification and literacy. Writing things down can take away some of the dynamism and fluidity, and it may be good for transferring knowledge, but also in some ways it can be static. So that has an impact. Obviously, there's a huge interest now in decolonizing ethnobotany and decolonizing ethnobiology. And that's because colonialism, imperialism, slavery, et cetera, have had major impacts on peoples and their relationship to plants and knowledge over many centuries, even before Western colonialism. So that's a particular kind of research that is becoming more prevalent. The effects of plant introduction, such as the Columbian Exchange, the movement of plants from the Americas to the Old World as a result of colonialism, and the various extinctions that have occurred. We could talk about the effects of commodification and the introduction of market economies into subsistence societies and how that causes change. We can see the impacts of agricultural intensification policies, often government-led, such as the Green Revolution, and how that changes people's relationship to plants. We can look at migrants and migration, what Andrea Peroni, Ina Vanderbroek, and others have labeled sort of traveling cultures. What happens to local knowledge systems and uses of plants as people move around the world, adapt to new environments, or bring their old environments with them via their plants and plant practices. And that's a very a kind of prominent field of ethnobotany today, a lot of it coming out of the Caribbean. And then, of course, the effects of habitat and landscape, climatic variations and changes all around the world, and how people are adapting to those and how people's relationship to plants is being affected. We can look at the impacts of innovation and creativity within communities and how that leads to changes in relationships. So the kind of internal drivers of change, and also, as I'll do in this presentation, think about how all these drivers intersect synergistically, producing a complex context for plant use and plant knowledge. All right. So here's some examples of change over time. Obviously, when we think about basic categories of plants in a folk classification, those categories are always changing. For instance, a basic category such as rice or maize will be broken down into many different varieties. And as people create new varieties, that category expands, knowledge associated with it expands. But also we can have the collapse of categories, like life form categories collapsing into one over time. Much has been written about the evolution of ethnobiological knowledge systems. You can look at Brent Berlin's fantastic book from 1992 that compiles a lot of that information up to that point about change and evolution in folk classification systems. But over time, we see that the number of life form at the life form category increases and diverges. So again, that's just internal to folk classification systems. We can chart change as, for instance, introductions. I talked about introduced plants. We can see those in the names themselves, how, for instance, the introduction of the tomato from the New World via the Dutch comes into Malaysia, to Eastern Indonesia, and by the time it gets to the Nuaulu and Seram, where Royal has been working, you can see the name tomati is very much derived from the tomato that we're familiar with in the West. So same with tobacco introduced. You can see how the introduced name is cognate and maintained over time. And this, again, we can also see within names origins, like ubi castella, that is the manioc in Eastern Indonesia, maintains its sort of Castilian Spanish origins. And then also how names reflect category extensions. For instance, the introduction of the tomato into French, the pomme d'amour, love apple, again, shows how people take introduced plants and kind of begin to name and classify them in relation to categories that they are more familiar with. Here's a really interesting study on domestication by Gary Nabhan and Rea from 1987. It's a kind of cross-sectional study interviewing people, asking them to identify varieties of devil's claw, a domesticate and two wild types, and showing through that how over time, as this domesticated species became more important, the devil's claw used for making baskets, and as baskets became an important commodity, talking about commodification, the emphasis on the domesticated became more important than the wild. Sorry. And the basic names for these particular plants shifted from an emphasis of the wild type as prototypical to the domesticate being prototypical. So you can see that in the variation in naming of these plants, a kind of process where domestication has shifted the importance away from the wild type to the domesticated. The wild type now becoming the coyote's devil's claw that is associated with the wild and not people anymore. Another important study has been work by Cecil Brown and others that has looked at the mode of subsistence and folk biological taxonomy, how the shift from hunting and gathering and foraging to agriculture actually produces an increase in the number of plants and animals known and used. The theory being that hunting and gathering societies are dependent on wild species, which are very much adapted, and they tend to not be quite threatened, whereas domesticated species and dependence on agriculture, there's always the risk of crop failure. And if there's a risk of crop failure, then you need to have backups, and the backups would be the wild plant species. And also agriculture creates new habitats, and so there are more plants, there are weeds, you have various stages of regrowth, fallow, and so people's exposure to the number of species and plant taxa increases. Anyway, so this is another example of how we think that ethnobiological knowledge and representation of the plant world has shifted and changed over time. These are a couple of posters from Mongolia that represent Tibetan medicine, Tibetan medicinal plants, and Tibetan herbal remedies. So again, this is about codification, producing these posters and information from Tibet, moving it to Mongolia. What is the impact of this kind of codification on Tibetan medicine as practiced in Mongolia as a result of this kind of thing? How dynamic is it? How do people interpret the plants, et cetera, in a new environment? Stanford Zent and Louisa Maffei have very helpfully been working on knowledge loss, biocultural diversity loss. And this is just an example of a study by them and to develop a vitality index of traditional environmental knowledge, a way of sort of quantifying people's knowledge in order to chart changes in that knowledge over time. And there you see on the left some of the questions they're trying to answer. How is knowledge actually being eroded, retained, or increased? How fast is it occurring? Which areas or groups are affected? Which domains are more vulnerable? What's the cause? Are these related to diversity, biodiversity loss? Are any kinds of policies or implementation measures actually effective? Which policies are working and which are not? So again, an example of kind of research that is trying to deal with change and monitoring it and potentially of use to ethnobotanists. Finally, one of the really remarkable studies, and I wish there were more of these, Becky Zarger and Rick Stepp in 2004 went back to, well, into early to late 1999, I should say, went back to the Telltal community where Brian Strauss did his PhD work in 1968, where he was looking at the way children acquire plant knowledge. And he innovated the plant trail, the use of a plant trail. So labeling plants along a trail and then having the children come along one by one and identify them. And they went back 20 years later and found that, in fact, 30 years later, that the knowledge that children have is very much the same. And that after 30 years of dramatic changes, young people in those communities are still learning plant names. They still have as much knowledge as their probably their parents and their grandparents did 30 years ago. And so that's a remarkable study, a longitudinal study that we need more of. We need people to take advantage of previous studies, go back, study them, and see what's happened. And then we get a sense of change or not change. In this case, a maintenance of traditional knowledge over generations, which they attribute to the fact that even though kids go to school, the school allows for children to go home, to work in the fields with their parents. So subsistence and exposure to plants and plant practices has still been maintained. Maybe not at the same level of intensity or length of time, but still important. Okay, so those are some examples of change, past studies in ethnobotany that have looked at knowledge shifts, knowledge change within, and also the impacts of knowledge on knowledge system. So let me now talk about our work in Karnataka. Okay, everyone is familiar with climate change and its various impacts. We've been interested in biodiversity changes, that is how plants and animals are shifting and changing as the climate changes. So going extinct, also invading, and you have explosions of pests like the plant hopper, grasshoppers, etc. We have shifts in altitude and in latitude of species as their ranges change, especially in the sea with fish. We have earlier springs and changes in the fruiting and flowering. And we have this worry about the asynchrony between pollinators and flowering. So these are all kinds of biodiversity changes that we're paying attention to. And, you know, people are beginning to look at what the impacts of climate change might be on agricultural productivity as we go forward. And this map kind of gives you a preview of areas that are probably going to suffer as a result of climate change in terms of agricultural productivity. And we know that this is obviously quite severe and problematic for our food production and consumption. And of course, there's a huge amount of research and work being done at the international level to try and address issues, whether it's genetically modifying crops to be more successful under drought conditions or water scarcity, or just innovating and creating new breeds that can survive under different environmental conditions. But also, we are noticing how traditional knowledge and local people are reinventing or rediscovering their various kinds of rainfall, rain harvesting mechanisms, et cetera, to respond to this. So there are responses to climate change and biodiversity change occurring at international levels and at local levels. And we're really interested in what local people are doing. And perhaps can we communicate between local responses to biodiversity change and international responses to biodiversity or national responses to biodiversity change? Okay, I just have a little, the wheel of death is going. So just hang on a second until the computer adjusts. Oh, very sorry. I don't know what is going on with my slides.
It's not moving?
No, there's something wrong with my slides. So I will stop sharing and see if I can figure this out.
Yeah, maybe you can once again
Okay, let's see here. What is going on?
Oh, you want me to do that? You can send through email.
No, I'm going to solve it right now. I've had to close down PowerPoint, and I will now try and get it back.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, while Dr. Raj fixes that, I'd just like to tell the participants that if they have any questions, they can put it out on the chat box so that we can discuss them on the later part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good idea. All right. I think we're back now. I'm really sorry.
No problem.
I've never had that happen before. So let's see here. I'm going to try and figure out where I am. Okay, share screen.
Yeah, we can see the screen, yes.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay, so I've been working in the Hills on the border with Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. As you can see here, it's known as the Hills Wildlife Sanctuary. This is actually quite new. Only in 2013 did it become a wildlife sanctuary. Before that, it was kind of a forest reserve. Now this is kind of unusual because in the middle of Hills was a huge temple town, and that gets more than 1 million pilgrims every year coming to various events. whether it's Diwali or Sankranti or anything like that. So it's kind of an unusual place to make a wildlife sanctuary, but it's close to the Tiger Reserve Sanctuary of the BR Hills and the Calvary Rivers Wildlife Sanctuary to the north. So I suppose it makes sense. The other reason why it's kind of unusual is it's totally impacted by Lantana camara. In that picture there, you can see Lantana camara almost as about 2.5 to 3 meters tall underneath the understory of the trees there. And that's what a lot of MM Hills looks like right now. But anyway, it does have a lot of wild elephants and tigers and leopards and bears and other wildlife, hence its status. But it also has a lot of people with a very long history of interactions. It's very much an anthropogenic landscape. This is the village of Kombodiki, where we've been doing research. It's a beautiful location in the mountains there. Not very big, maybe 650 people or so. Lingayets, who are a sort of a religious caste who moved into the area about 100 years ago, and the Soliga, who are a tribal group that have lived in this area for who knows how long. They live together in this community. And this is a farming community where people are dependent on millet and grow a bit of grow maize and castor and sunflower which are sold for oil. They collect broom grass, bamboo baskets, amla, and others from the forest. And the young people go off to work in quarries or in plantations to make some money. And they graze cattle, goats, and buffalo in the forests that surround them. There's some of the basket making from the bamboo that's collected in the forests. This is the Soliga hamlet at the southern end of the community. You'll notice behind it terraces going up the hill. All of these are full of Lantana camara, as you can see on both sides of the road. So Lantana is, there is a native species of Lantana in India, indica, but camara is what is the invasive, and there you can see how it's crowding around the trails of this woman as she walks to her fields. It is one of the top 5 invasive species in the world, brought to the UK, brought to India by UK colonists in 1807 in Calcutta, where it jumped the garden walls. You can see it's a very pretty little flower, so brought as an ornamental, smells nice, but it's escaped and covered most of southern India, up into Bhutan now, South Africa, Australia, dry tropic areas. It does very well. Local people recognize 3 different varieties, which they call white, red, and sort of blackish or purple. A sort of Soliga name is rose stick or Janakadi, but the Canada name is pretty much used by everyone, which is Jedi Gida. And many of you may know that it literally means useless plant. And so local people are very perceptive about this invasive species. And there's just kind of charts here how this plant has moved around via colonial trade routes and settlers to various parts of the world where it has in fact caused havoc with agriculture, etc. So I'll spare you on the ecological studies, but everyone knows kind of what the invasive species can do in this area. It gets into the understory. Besides kind of alienating agricultural land after a couple of years, it gets into the understory of the trees. It suppresses grasses, fodder, wild plants that are used for medicine or food, and therefore affects food availability. It also makes it difficult to travel through the forest because, as you can see, it's very impenetrable. So we've been doing research in these communities with both men and women, trying to find out what they know about Lantana and how they're responding to it. And this has involved a bunch of typical kinds of methods that you're all familiar with: mapping exercises, forest walks, informal interviews, group interviews, et cetera, et cetera. For local people, the most important impacts are reduced abundance of forest resources, which are used for subsistence and commercial, and the reduction in the safe and easy access to forest. But of course, this varies with age, sex, and ethnicity. So different groups of people within the community are impacted differently. And this is extremely important to understand. This is what some of the local people say about Lantana. It's like a devil that's come to our lands. When this Lord Shani came in the form of Lantana, it covered up all our country grasses. All other things died. Now it's impossible to get a bag full of grass. We push our way into the forest. We cannot drink that water. We fall sick. We use it for manure. But as we have Lantana, we sweep it aside and select the good nuts and make way for ourselves. Even gooseberries too, if this covers the gooseberry trees. So this gives you a kind of idea of the different ways people talk about Lantana and its impacts and how people respond to it. Some of the direct responses is the use of Lantana is cut to use fencing, to fence fields, as you can see in the top. You can burn it. It does produce a fairly good ash, and people will clear their fields before they plant and burn the Lantana. But if you leave your field fallow for more than 2 years, it becomes so thick and so entrenched, it's almost impossible to clear. But if you do it annually, you can use the ash to fertilize the fields along with manure. People are paid by the government now to clear Lantana from the roadsides, as you saw in that picture. So it does generate cash, despite its ecological catastrophe. It can provide a bit of medicine. People used to use traditionally indica, Lantana indica, for a dermatological salve, which you can use this invasive as well. And people are starting to make furniture. A-Tree started a project getting people to make furniture from Lantana cane. Looks a bit like cane furniture, but that's fairly limited to 1 or 2 experimental sites. It's difficult to market it locally. It has to be marketed in Bangalore and etc. But it is one way to try and find uses. They're now developing perhaps a biochar kind of project to convert all this biomass into burnable pellets, which isn't a bad idea. But again, that there are some complications with getting that up off of the ground. Just some pictures of the Lantana being cleared. I mean, they need to fence the fields now because of the invasion of the forest by Lantana means there's less food for the wild animals too, including elephants and pigs, deer. And so these animals are coming into the villages now. So it's causing human-wildlife conflicts. And people now have to protect their fields even more from invasion of wildlife. So what we tried to do in our research here is we focused on cattle grazing. People said that takes longer to graze now. There's not enough food, and that as a result of this, diets are weakening the cattle and goats and making them vulnerable. And of course, it's dangerous now to graze cattle in the forest because you can't see wildlife. You can't see bears, you can't see elephants. Tigers, of course, are nocturnal, but there is a fear that you'll encounter a wild animal and get dangerous. And in fact, there was a person who was killed by sloth bears while we were doing research. Again, this kind of just collided into them on a path where you couldn't see anymore. And so we decided to start to do research on how Lantana was impacting grazing and the use of fodder species. So this is the sort of ethnobotanical bit, is how is people's relationship to fodder changing as a result of Lantana. And we have a bunch of different kinds of methods that we used, including basically following people around as they're grazing, which is good old-fashioned participant observation, to see how they have changed their grazing patterns, where they go, what cattle eat, how is it impacted, etc. We collected fodder species and produced voucher specimens, and then we used a plant identification exercise with local people to see how much they knew about these fodder species. And we could see that, of course, young people know less than older people. That's what you'd expect. But there was a distinct difference in knowledge between the Soliga and the Lingayat people, which was interesting, and we're exploring that. And I would say that younger adults who are not grazing know a lot less than those who are grazing. And of course, here we are following grazers into the forest, watching where they go, seeing what cattle eat, and talking to grazers there about their knowledge of what's happening and how they're responding. It's difficult to tell how, whether or not, or how people are actually responding, and whether it's in fact due to Lantana. And this is an important point here, is that there may be many reasons that people are grazing cattle the way they're grazing it and making choices that they're making, and they may not all be due to Lantana. And so this is one of the methodological points that we wanted to make, is that we might typically ask a question like, how does Lantana affect grazing pathways, which in a logical sense is going from causes to effects. The problem is that that's vulnerable to confirmation bias. You're only looking for the impacts of Lantana and trying to connect them to changes and say where people go or what grasses they eat. And what we have argued is that you need to turn the question around and go from effects to causes, and ask the question, why do grazers go where they go, rather than how is Lantana impacting grazing? And then that way, you're studying an actual practice that may have changed, and then asking why they're doing what they're doing. And in fact, when you do that, in this case, yes, people talk about Lantana. Here you see a trail almost overgrown. It's impossible to get through this. So that is an important factor. Here you see a wild bull elephant in the middle of the picture here. And you can see its tusks surrounded by the wildlife. So if people hear elephants, they change their grazing paths, or if they see evidence of elephants, they change where they're going, and if they hear them. They may actually be interested in certain species. They may head to areas that have a high diversity of different kinds of grasses. They may, again, graze in places that are particularly abundant in certain grasses. They may go to places where they have preferred grasses. This is called Naleulu, and it's a preferred grass. It supposedly gives very high nutritious milk, which is good for both the calves and people that use the milk for butter or drinking. They may go where to avoid steep slopes, which is a risk of animals falling and hurting themselves. They may, in fact, just allow the cattle to lead them, which is really an interesting comment from local people. Said, well, we don't actually take the cattle out. They kind of take us. They know where they're going, and we follow them, which isn't always the case, but that, they may, in fact, be dictated by cattle practices, which in this case of goats may have preferred species that they like, which may be directing them around the forest. People may also be doing many things at the same time, like this Soliga guy who is collecting bamboo to make baskets. So his grazing path makes sure that it intersects bamboo groves where he can harvest at the same time. People may be concerned about the health of their animals, and that may affect where they go and when, or preferences, depending on the age of people who are doing the grazing, like this grandfather. He's not perhaps as mobile as young people, and so may not go as far into the forest. And that goes for women and children too, who are now afraid of the forest, fearful of the animals, and so will not barely go into the forest, but stay around the edges. And of course, climatic differences and changes in seasonality. Here, the dry season grazing in and around the Lantana-filled terraces. So what we find is when we switch from causes to effects to causes logically, that there are all these different kinds of factors that go into the way people graze. And Lantana is just one of these. So avoiding slopes and wild animals, the concern for health and weather, the abundance of grasses, the availability of labor to graze, non-timber forest product needs, and now forest restrictions as it's a wildlife sanctuary. These are all affecting where people go and why. Again, emphasizing the complexity of change drivers that are affecting people's relationship to fodder and cattle livelihood. So overall, what we found is that Lantana is of little value to people, really. It is catalyzing an intergenerational transformation towards markets and market economies as opposed to subsistence. The wildlife sanctuary is restricting access. There's a decrease in cattle numbers. Many people are selling off their cattle or outsourcing them to the lowlands where other people can take care of them for a pretty hefty fee. And this has consequences right across the culture, which I'll be looking at in future research. We know that knowledge of fodder is lower in the youth, but some young people do want to carry on grazing and being herders. And so hopefully knowledge won't be lost about fodder and fodder species. In fact, as more people decide not to graze cattle anymore, or to get out of it altogether, that means that the few households that are left have more forest resources that they can make use of, despite the difficulties, and they may rely on harvesting agricultural wastes like the stalks of millet or rice, harvesting wild species on the bunds around the fields or from the edges of the forest, or even cutting leaves from trees to feed goats, etc., in order to keep their stocks alive. But basically, people used to have as many as 100 head of cattle per family. Now you see they may have 1 or 2, or they may have around 5 to 10. So different strategies that people are using. So what the study has emphasized, I think, is that biodiversity change, like Lantana invasion, is only one of many drivers of change in the villages of India, and that the observed responses are driven or constrained by one or many different drivers, that using participant observation and ACE, which I didn't really talk about, but this idea of causal analysis, thinking about how people are responding in terms of looking at what they're doing and asking what are the causes, allows us to judge how important biodiversity change is in comparison to other things. Young people, don't want to be farmers. They want to move to the city. They want to get jobs outside of the village. And perhaps a subsistence life as a farmer is not as valued as it used to be. But also it's difficult with Lantana camara and changes to governance structures and accessibility of the forest. So there are many different things that are going on in these communities that are not just ecological and not just economic, they're also social and cultural. But people do understand what's going on, they do have knowledge, and they are responding autonomously to and adapting to this situation. And there's much we can learn from local knowledge and local adaptation to help integrate lower sort of on the ground responses with national and international policies with regard to adaptation to climate change, for instance. And we're seeing that knowledge is being maintained, but some knowledge is being lost as these practices disappear, perhaps. But there, as we said, there seem to be a few stalwarts who are taking advantage, actually, of a less crowded forest in order to keep grazing cattle on what little is left. And who knows, maybe evolution and nature will do its work and some creature will discover how much lantana there is to be eaten, and the problem will be, so to speak, solved by itself. Okay, so I will stop there. Many thanks to all my colleagues at ATRI who've been absolutely invaluable. Here's to the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj, for that wonderful talk. I must say that you took us through beginning from the ethnobotany of change, from the basics, from quotes by Sholiga community. It got a lot of memories that I have experienced with the tribe as well. Before anyone has any questions, they can type it out in the chat box. But we already have a few questions. And if you are okay, can I take the first question? The first question is by Dr. Radhakrishnan. The question is basically in the chat box, and I'm going to read it out to you. It says that we are documenting and utilizing traditional knowledge in many ways for our personal benefits and research. What else we give the knowledge holders or the community in return? And he wants your view on that.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. When we engage with communities through free, prior, and informed consent, we also try and figure out ways that we can contribute to the communities. My colleagues Harish and others have been. Please mute yourselves.
Yeah, I kindly request the participants to be on mute.
Can you mute yourselves? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I would have to say that, people at A-Tree have been really incredible in the kind of efforts they've made to develop non-timber forest products and help stimulate that commercial income for people, doing conservation work to help preserve some of the important commercial crops in that area, like the amla trees. And in fact, Harish ran a project a few years ago to establish a nursery to grow important wild plant species that are being impacted by Lantana in the forest and put them into people's gardens. So in a sense, the beginning of the process of domestication, but in rescuing plants that are impacted by Lantana and putting them into people's gardens. And I think one thing that we did in this project is we made a film. We made a video. We interviewed lots of people. We filmed them. We filmed during Sankranti, the 3-day ritual and festivities in January. We made a film that integrates it and have people talking about Lantana and its impacts. And we gave that back to the community. We interviewed lots of children, so they were very excited and they could show it in the school. And it kind of captured, in a way, their voices and their experiences and how this is impacting their lives. And so these kinds of things of returning results, giving back information, just feeding back the kind of knowledge that you've collected is really helpful and valuable because, as we know, ethnobotanical knowledge is distributed amongst people in a community. Not everyone knows everything. Everyone knows bits and pieces, and actually an ethnobotanist can do quite a job to synthesize and put that knowledge together and return it in various ways. And I think that's not such a difficult thing to do, really. Many of our students put together little plant manuals of plants.
Dr. Siddhappa is also there online, huh?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Can we take a few more questions if you don't mind?
Nishant?
Yes.
Can I add one point to what Dr. Puri said?
Yeah, please, sir.
Dr. Puri, yes, I'm also an ethnobotanist. I worked among the Western Ghats tribals of Kerala. Okay.
Oh, great. Oh,
but
excellent.
You see, what is happening here is that though we are, my specific question is that, but we are not now supporting them to retain their knowledge. You see, for the case of ethnomedicine, they are not being recognized, but the basic knowledge we are taking, nobody is answering to this point. The scientists, I'm a scientist, nobody is answering to this crucial point. No, it should be useful to a society. That is why it should be useful to a society. So when we are not recognizing the mother of all medicine systems. How can we work? We have got so many of crores of projects, all these things, but we have, I am just requesting you to take these things to the forefront. Unless these people are, the traditional communities are benefited, nothing will work. We can simply present papers, all these things, and see, only big companies and all these are benefited. That is the point from my level I know. So this is just to request people like you as ethnobotanists, we have to do such things. Okay, recognition of traditional knowledge at the government level. One important thing, they are telling that there is no science. They have their own science. The modern, we should not adopt a modern science for a traditional knowledge. That is the key point we have to undertake, because that was they have, by trial and error they have developed. We were utilizing for years, and now we are finding fault with them after getting their knowledge. That is the problem. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radhakrishnan. We will move to the next question, which is actually we asked questions before the seminar, and I saw a pattern of similar interests of students across the world who want to know the relevance of ethnobotanical studies, especially in the modern world. And if you could also cover the challenges and future prospects for Lantana camara as a species. So if you could take these two questions in one, that would be great. Thank you.
Ooh, that's a big question. What's the relevance of ethnobotany today? I mean, look, we're totally dependent on plants, aren't we? For food, for medicine, for building, you know, for shade in these increasing climate change. And so I think in terms of, you know, ethnobotany is not just about tribal people's knowledge. It's about everyone's knowledge of plants. Here in London, you know, we have lots of studies going on how city people are planting gardens, having allotments, increased foraging, vertical farming, urban agriculture. You know, ethnobotany covers everything, all people and all plant people relationships. And that's relevant around the world to the way our cities are growing and how they'll be more sustainable, how will they be cooled, how will people reduce food miles, for instance, by growing more locally. So I think ethnobotanical research has a huge role to play in terms of better understanding how our relationship to plants moves forward into the future. Of course, there's a lot we can learn from traditions, whether it's medicinal plants, food plants, and other kinds of products that come from plants, of
music,
course.
plants, music for music instruments.
Yeah, we can share, you know, there's so much knowledge out there that can be shared and useful. I mean, now people, there's a popular policy called nature-based solutions. So in this transformation to net zero, to reducing our dependence on fossil fuel, for dealing with climate change, increasing population, et cetera, people are looking at nature-based solutions. It's an old idea, but it's now packaged as nature-based solutions. And of course, nature-based solutions could involve rewilding, more sustainable agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And for a lot of those things, we can talk to local people or traditional people or people with deep traditional knowledge and learn from them. And I think this kind of humble approach to innovation, you know, paying attention to what our ancestors and other people have done in the past is key. Of course, in all of these, we have to be ethical and careful in the way that we use knowledge and acknowledge people for their knowledge and ensure that benefits that might arise are shared equally and fairly amongst people who have generated this knowledge. And that's not such an easy thing to do, but we as ethnobotanists have been working on it for 30, 40 years now, trying to find ways to return results, to be responsible, to do bioprospecting in a responsible manner. It's a difficult ethical decision that you as a researcher have to make individually about how you want to be involved and what you can do. But clearly there's so much that we can learn and use And as for the future of Lantana, I don't know. As I said, I think in India, certainly, and in places like South Africa and Australia, they've tried using natural biocontrol methods to control it, but they haven't been successful.
You are muted.
Yeah, I know. I realized.
Yeah.
So there is there's the possibility that some natural predator will arise that will consume Lantana. I think perhaps turning Lantana into biochar to be used in stoves, etc., is a potential. Certainly, people are looking into that. I know Atri is looking into that, and I think if it's matched with a plan to harvest Lantana in such a way that the reduction of Lantana on the landscape is in a sensible, logical manner, and not just willy-nilly taking. In other words, you want to help people clear agricultural terraces of Lantana, and if you can use that for biochar, great. But a kind of harvesting plan that in fact benefits people by reversing the alienation that's been caused by Lantana, I think is a sensible way to approach it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we have to learn to live with it.
One more question has come. Does invasive and exotic plant species affect the local bird and butterfly diversity?
Well, I'm not an ecologist. I mean, folks from Atri can tell you that. I know that it produces little berries that the birds love. And so I don't think the birds have been so impacted. And in fact, the birds are spreading Lantana all over the place through their droppings because they've got tiny seeds. And once the birds eat them, they go everywhere. And so I think birds are doing quite fine. I don't know about butterflies, but again, they do produce a lot of very aromatic flowers. So maybe butterflies are okay.
Yeah. One more question. Any joint IP or patent between scientists and tribal society has done in this study?
Nothing like that, no. No. Not yet.
One more question. How does the invasive species affect the native flora and fauna? Almost similar.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
similar.
As I said, what it does is it's so thick that it literally suppresses, it cuts out the light to the understory, so that herbs, grasses, and even the regeneration of certain forest trees is suppressed. And because the leaves have got a toxic substance in them, when the leaves fall into water, you get a kind of tea-looking water, which is actually quite toxic. And so that's the main impacts that have been documented by Atri scientists, et cetera, and ecologists when they look at how Lantana impacts the landscape.
Yeah. One more thing is that what is the use of Lantana in its native land? Is it good practices to introduce alien species, even it has medicinal values, to another land? It will be disaster in future. Just a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. No, well, it wasn't introduced it was introduced intentionally, but as an ornamental more than 200 years ago in India, but it's interestingly, it didn't spread right away. It has spread more recently, like in southern Karnataka, I believe, the opening up of forests, the reduction in 1972, the ban on forests, the use of fire into those forests, the Soliga traditionally and the Lingayats burned the forest floor every year around Sankranti in January, just before the dry season, to clear out the understory, to kill off weeds, and keep the forest open. And that would have controlled things like Lantana. And once that was banned, there was no fire. Local people lost a lot of benefits from that and uses of the forest. And now you get this incredible fuel loading. So Lantana can be quite flammable, actually. and causes forest fires. So that's one of the reasons, I think. So what I was saying is that it didn't immediately spread across India when it was introduced. It's only due to disturbances in various places that it has then got a foothold. And so, yes, we can expect more invasive species and more invasive pests. It's the really big issue that agriculturalists are shaking in their boots over, is plant pathologies. You know, the effects of climate change on the spread of pests, plant diseases, whether it's fungi or molds or other kinds of viruses, is huge and unseen. You know, as we've seen with COVID, I think that's, you know, the invisible world is really going to impact us as we go forward with climate change, and it will affect our agriculture and our wildlife in ways we can't even predict yet.
Thank you. Because of lack of time, we'll just take one last question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this question also is common to all our speakers here, is because ethnobotany as a subject, there's the common factor is time, and the knowledge is eroding at a really rapid pace. So you need to sort of prioritize your studies, even if you set out to do an ethnobotanical study. So if there are young researchers here who would like to ask what could be the priority areas under ethnobotanical studies you think that should be done sooner, so that it's for the good of the subject and the knowledge itself.
As I said, I think ethnobotany is very broad and it covers many different subjects. Our students do everything from biochemistry and bioprospecting and ethnopharmacology studies to studying regenerative agriculture, vertical farming, and as well as historical studies on the uses of plants in the past. And all of these will have relevance to today. I think the kind of salvage ethnography mentality that the world's knowledge is disappearing is probably right in many cases. And I think if you're in a position where you can do research amongst a group of people where the knowledge is threatened, then you should. And if it's possible, you know, because these are not easy things to do and very easy to get access. You really need to know the local language to understand the folk classification system and the meanings, the deep meanings of plants in a symbolic and religious sense, and to spend a lot of time, because knowledge is not just sitting there and writing things down. You have to observe people, watch what they do, because so much knowledge is tacit. It's sort of unconsciously acquired and used, and people don't even, you know, they really don't even think about it because it's just what they do. And that documentation, whether you use video, which is, I think, a really great thing to do, is to film people doing these kinds of practices that involve plants and involve knowledge, and then showing people the videos and asking them about the kind of knowledge that's involved, and documenting practices that use plants, whether it's making a basket, making a fire, growing a garden, harvesting fruit. These are things that will last, that perhaps younger people can learn from. And just by doing your research, you can actually stimulate communities and people to think about preserving their own knowledge. Our basketry study, one of the communities we worked in, they set up workshops to start teaching their children basket making, because they realized it really wasn't being transmitted. It wasn't organized enough. So they got organized. The researchers had nothing to do with this. It was the community themselves decided they wanted to ensure that their knowledge was transmitted. Languages are an important part of that too, because so much of our culture and knowledge is embedded in language. If we lose languages, we lose knowledge. And, that's a big, I don't want to put such a big responsibility on young researchers. The important thing when you're doing research is to find things that are curious and interesting to you, that are meaningful, and you'll do good research that way. And we have to hope that collectively our research will impact policymakers and help communities to recognize the importance of what they have. You know, we can't all individually save the world, but you can make a small little contribution, and that's good enough, really. That's good. So as I said, if you're in a position where you can work with people where their knowledge is threatened somehow, and they're interested in learning more about their own knowledge or having you document it and feed it back to them, great. But don't feel obligated. It's not for everyone, and not everyone is in that kind of a position.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajindra Puri. Before we end, I would like to thank you from the Tropical Botany and Ethnobiology Lab at the Czech University of Life Sciences, and also from CCM.
Sir, I have one question, one small question.
Yes, but Dr. Raj, are you okay with that?
No, I will take that is half minute. I will take 30 seconds. Just my query is that is I need some recent information regarding books published abroad to teach my students in Ethnobotany, because it is a SEC, that is a skill enhancement course related UG syllabus. So just please suggest some books. So through mail we will take reference.
I will put this. Yes, thank you for your question. I'll put this out over an email to Dr. Rajindra Puri. I hope that's okay with him. And we will get back to you through email. Yes? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do that. Thanks.
So, like I was saying, thank you from the Tribe Lab and the CCNR team at TDU for accepting this invitation. Before we end, there's a proverb from you. There's an African proverb that says that wisdom is like a baobab tree. No one individual can embrace it. So, and that's what we were talking about today. That's unity, and how we all need to come together to discuss about this beautiful subject of ethnobotany. I would request now the participants to kindly come on video, because we have a tradition to take a group picture. The least we could do in today's world to show that we are all together in this. So I request all the participants to come on the video mode so I can take a group picture quickly for us. And then at the count of 3, I'm going to take the picture. So I hope you have all your smiles ready. So I can still see some people are switching on their camera. So I'll just wait for a few more seconds. Yes. So I'm going to start now at the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for your time. Thank you for joining with us. As usual, we're going to upload this on the YouTube page of TDU and Czech University of Life Science, so that you all can also see the recorded version. I'm sure you would want to listen to this wonderful talk again and then think more about this subject. Thank you all for your time, and I wish you join again in our next webinar series, and take good care of yourselves, because our community is really, really less. So I request you to take good care of yourselves.
Okay.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Nishan. Thank you, Puri. Yeah, thanks for all the people who have come. Yeah, thank you.